And we're back in our TVP World studio. I'm Claudia Czerwińska, your host, and you are watching World Talks Context. We are now going to be joined by our next guest, Louis Wierenga, lecturer in international relations, the Baltic Defense College, in order to talk about the risks which are carried not only with the national card scheme in Hungary, but also the recent exchange of prisoners between Russia and the U.S. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us here on TVP World for World Talks Context. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
We basically witnessed what was probably the biggest exchange of prisoners between Russia and the U.S. Since the Cold War. Many other countries, including Poland, were involved in the process, as I mentioned in my speech before. And at the same time, we are looking at the national card scheme in Hungary, where one of the EU members, is opening possible floodgates to Russians and Belarusians who could work in their national intelligence. To ask directly, how much does the threat from Russia, how much of a threat this is to the Baltic states specifically?
Well, it's a big threat to the Baltic states and Poland as well. I mean, what we have seen from the Russian Federation is that despite whatever they may or may not want to do towards NATO countries, a kinetic option is not on the table right now due to them being bogged down in Ukraine and due to the failures of that war with the Russian Federation. But the proximity of the Baltic Sea region, so the three Bs of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, as well as Poland, both to Russia and Belarus, creates some vulnerabilities for all of the countries. And Russia is getting better, but we're also getting better at detecting these. So they have a diverse toolbook, which includes disinformation and hostile information, cyber attacks, psychological pressure, instrumentalized migration, and various acts of sabotage. And they monitor closely the response from all of the different agencies and personnel involved. So that's going to be a constantly evolving threat on both sides, and it's one that we're going to have to prepare for the seriousness and severity increasing.
Exactly. So do you think that NATO, do you think that the European Union are actually stepping up their game when it comes to eliminating and neutralizing this threat that could be potentially coming from both of these countries?
Absolutely. As much as is possible. We hear a lot when we're talking about the sphere of cyber deterrence, and the offender and the aggressor typically has the upper hand, and that's one of the things with hybrid warfare, that it includes cyber but is not limited to cyber, that you see an evolving understanding to try to pre-bunk mis and disinformation. It's only a matter of time before AI gets us to the point where it's much easier to make a deep fake video or audio recording to increase meddling in elections, but also increase different societal cleavages. And I think that the sort of concerted effort, if you look at, for example, Latvia, introducing this notion of patriotic education to youngsters when they are school children, prior to becoming teenagers, so already starting to teach about different things at school, and the Estonians have a very good cyber literacy program. These things are only going to be accelerated because with the speed and severity of information traffic, it's becoming something that we could change almost daily. So we have to keep up to date with that, and that is definitely going on. There is a cyber center of excellence. It's an EU, but not a NATO cyber hybrid center of excellence in Helsinki, and they do great research on these topics.
With the events of the past 48 hours, it's incredibly important to, I think, mention the exchange of hostages that I spoke about only a few minutes ago. Alongside the hybrid warfare context, I think there's also a concept of a possible hostage diplomacy from Russia. Do you think that we're entering a new stage of Russian-US, Russian-West relations, and there could be a risk of that hostage diplomacy taking place, where we have to trade people who are trading secrets?
The latter, potentially. The former, no. I do not think that anybody should look at this as a sort of thaw and U.S.-Russia relations, especially considering what we just talked about and the ongoing war of aggression and conquest that Russia is illegally waging in Ukraine. There's not a reset of relations. But what I do think what will likely happen is that we will see more hostage diplomacy. So the United States SHEPA has been working on this for a while, and there were two high-profile U.S. citizens who were not part of the Thursday deal between the United States, their European allies, and the Kremlin, including one school teacher who was convicted in 2022 for possessing marijuana, and a dual U.S.-Russian citizen who was arrested this year on a bogus charge of treason because she donated, I think, $51 to a Ukrainian charity. They were not included in the exchange. And I think that means that obviously the Russian Federation wants more of these high-profile prisoners to be released. And that's definitely a trade-off, because we saw a little bit over a year ago with Brittany Griner, the WNBA star. Mm-hmm. That was prior to yesterday's deal, the most high-profile prisoner trade at swap, I would say, in years. This one definitely at the end of the Cold War. And the person that the U.S. gave the Russian Federation was a notorious arms dealer, and one of the agents that was responsible in capturing him and helping bring him to justice said that he would just go back out there and donate arms and create problems with the Wagner group in Africa and in Venezuela. And he was arrested sending arms to a U.S. designated terrorist group. So this is diplomacy at its highest level, so high, in fact, that the Biden administration was able to keep this under wraps during a high intensity, turbulent period for them. So it was a diplomatic win for the United States, but I do think we need to be cautious, because when these types of things proceed, the Russian Federation, of course, will become more demanding in their requests.
So where do we draw the line? Because you're talking about Russia possibly becoming more demanding. Where do we draw the line? When enough is enough?
Well, I think that one of the most important things is that the United States and their NATO allies are all on the same page. I mean, this was a definite good collaboration between Poland, between Norway, Slovenia, Germany, and the United States, and they couldn't have done it without each other. So I think maintaining cohesion and making sure that requests are done in the most diplomatic and friendliest of ways among allies is one thing, and that nobody is left feeling that it could create some kind of negative political cleavage or some kind of vector for information warfare, because remember, this is something that the Russian Federation and even their sort of partners such as Iran and China will likely try to use to drive a wedge between the U.S. and their European allies. I think the second thing to take into consideration is how dangerous are the people that are being released? What is how likely are they to start doing these types again? In most cases, probably very likely. I mean, one of the most high-profile prisoners released to the Russian Federation murdered a Georgian who was fighting in Chechnya against the Russians in broad daylight in a Berlin park. So, I mean, that is not the type of person who would likely just call it quits and throw in the towel and behave like a law-abiding citizen. So I think those are types of things to be taken into consideration, but that's also easy for me to say, not having a diplomatic or political post.
Shortly, just before we go, I wanted to ask you about the U.S. perspective of what just happened with the swap of prisoners. President Joe Biden stressed that it was one of his priorities to make sure that these people are back on the U.S. soil. Do you think that this swap is actually going to affect the upcoming presidential elections for the Democrats?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, Joe Biden's vice president, Kamala Harris, and the almost inevitable Democratic frontrunner played a key and clear role in this at the Munich Security Conference, both with Slovenian Prime Minister Golob and also with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. And this is one of the first big foreign policy engagements that she has taken part of, and then also lends a good win to the Biden administration, because this is a one-term presidency for him. He announced very recently, as we all know, that he was not going to seek re-election. So in that sense, the Democratic camp, which is likely going to be Harris, but whoever it is will be carrying the torch for a second Democratic administration, even though not a Biden administration, and which puts them in a precarious place against the definite Trump campaign. But the second part is to take into consideration is that in election years, and especially this election year, we've seen in just a month the news cycle being changed completely at least 3 times in sequence. And a lot can happen between now and November 5th. And we are at the under 100 days mark. And so it'll be interesting to see how the Trump campaign responds about the criticism. And I would suspect that they would say that we need to demand more and that these people should have gotten out sooner and that they would have gotten them out sooner. But this is something that the Biden administration had been working on for a long time. And this is one of the most complex and robust diplomatic exchanges across countries, which I think was definitely an impressive feat. So my answer is that yes, it will, but it is very likely that it could disappear from the news cycle depending on what happens in the next.
Indeed, there's still a long way. There's still a long way ahead of the election. So this is going to be an interesting thing to observe. Thank you so much, Louis Wierenga, lecturer in the International Relations, Baltic Defense College.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us here in the studio.
My pleasure.
Pleasure's all mine. And so this would be all the latest here on World Talks Context, but stay with us because we have one more interview coming where we're going to focus on the situation in the Middle East.